If I asked you to describe your ideal supercar, I may get all sorts of answers depending on your tastes. Would it have gullwing doors? Be capable of 200 miles an hour plus? What about a power plant? Would you like a high-revving rotary engine? Maybe a naturally aspirated V8? Or even maybe a turbo diesel for that everyday usability? Who would you want to manufacture it? Possibly a marque with a rich racing history that was also making incredibly reliable, well-engineered cars. If you answered yes to any or even all of the above, that car existed in the 1970s, but nobody has one. Here's why. The 300 SL of the 1950s was the world's first supercar. Of course, there's some controversy here. Many believe it to be Gandini's Miura of 1966, because it has the distinction of having a mid-mounted engine. I think to look at the question through such a semantic lens is to instantly miss the point of a supercar, which is predisposed more with raw feeling and emotion than any technicality like where the engine is positioned. The 300 SL was so far and away beyond the ordinary road traffic of its day that it's impossible not to call it super, maybe even hyper. But that's besides the point. What followed the 300 SL was most definitely not a supercar. And so, from 1963, Mercedes-Benz had a gap in its lineup. And you needn't think for a minute that Daimler-Benz in the 1960s was the sort of enterprise that would overlook such a gap. In 1965, a design study was commissioned for a halo car to sit above the Pagoda SL, which had replaced the 300 SL. As mentioned, the Pagoda was no supercar, but let it be said, no slouch either. It won rallies, like the Spa-Sophia-Liège, and Uhlenhaut put it around a track within 0.2 of a second of a 3-litre Ferrari 250 GT Berlinetta, driven by Michael Parks, himself an accomplished driver and MD of Alvis. This new car was envisioned as a big brother to the Pagoda to begin with, but quickly developed into something more like a Miura. It would be mid-engined, with the M100 engine from the 600 bored out to nearly 7 litres. It would bring back gullwing doors. The designs produced by Paul Brack and his colleague Giorgio Battistella were unlike anything which had worn a Mercedes badge. A sleek, low design with pop-up headlights. The front end not unlike the C3 Corvette, which would debut 3 years later. It was called the SLX. It was too much for management, too close to the sun. It made it as far as a full-size model, which is still held by the Mercedes-Benz Museum today, before being cancelled sometime in 1966. The next chapter in this story appeared in 1969. This is the main subject of this video, but it wasn't even planned to be a sports car. No, the sleek and appealing car you see here was to be nothing more than a test mule. Initially for the Wankel rotary engines, which were believed to be the future of car propulsion in the late 60s. The looks of the thing weren't lost on at least someone at Daimler-Benz, since the car appeared on the Mercedes stand at the Frankfurt Motor Show in 1969. Nor were they lost on the general public, from which several blank cheques appeared in Untertürkheim, with the purpose of purchasing such an automobile. C111-1 of 1969 was the initial mule for testing a 280 horsepower, 3-rotor Wankel engine. 5 examples were built, capable of 0 to 60 miles an hour in 5 seconds, and 160 miles an hour at top speed. The cars had an early version of the 5-point multi-link rear suspension, which wouldn't be seen in production until the W201 of 1982. And was leagues ahead of the diagonal swing arms and semi-trailing arms found on Mercedes passenger cars of the day. The 3-rotor Wankel was underpowered, and the body required refinement. For the C111, the designer had been a young Bruno Sacco, who penned a much more futuristic car than the earlier SLX. That iconic orange paint is called Weissherbst, or White Autumn. 1 year later, C111-2 appeared, equipped with a more powerful 4-rotor Wankel, with 350 horsepower and capable of 300 km per hour. The cars periodically had their engines swapped to V8s to compare performance. It became clear that the rotary engine just could not be made to work to the standard of reliability demanded by Mercedes' reputation. Fuel consumption was excessive, and exhaust emissions were too high. Any sports-oriented Mercedes would be aimed at California as a large part of its market share. By the mid-1960s, the state already had strict emissions rules to combat the smog. C111-2 was an improvement over C111-1. It was lighter with a more refined shape, bringing the drag coefficient down to a very impressive 0.325. The 1973 oil crisis was the final nail in the coffin for a rotary-powered Mercedes. Even if the reliability and emissions issues could be overlooked, fuel consumption was now top priority for buyers. Diesel, on the other hand, was very fuel efficient, and to boot was viewed as a clean fuel at this time, as the effect of particulate matter and sulfur dioxide on human health had not been well studied yet. Mercedes-Benz had produced the first commercially available diesel car in the 30s, and had developed and innovated it ever since. Its drawback was that it wasn't very quick or exciting. Fortunately, Daimler-Benz were at the forefront in developing turbocharging. A turbocharged and intercooled OM617 5-cylinder diesel engine was installed into one of the C111-2s. This setup would be known as the C111-2D. And made 190 horsepower instead of the 80 the naturally aspirated unit managed. The car was taken to the Nardo banked circuit in 1976 and put through a grueling 60-hour trial, stopping only to refuel and switch drivers every 2.5 hours and achieving an overall average speed of 254 km per hour, establishing 16 diesel records in the process. Encouraged by this success, the team, led by Dr. Hans Schoenberg, had a new goal in mind: 300 km per hour. This would require considerable modification to the aerodynamics of the C111, turning it into a dedicated record breaker. The C111-3 was back at Nardo in 1978. Wheels were enclosed, and the car sat low with a long tail and a vertical stabilizer.
The start.
All of this managed a drag coefficient of 0.183, incredible even by today's standards. The OM617 diesel had its boost turned up and lightly modified camshafts among other upgrades to provide a power output of 230 horsepower. The first runs achieved speeds of 260 km per hour before a tyre blowout damaged the car. Fortunately, 2 examples had been produced, and the replacement was rushed to the south of Italy, where it smashed through the 300 km per hour mark to achieve an average of 321 km per hour. There was one last record for this project to break. In 1975, Mark Donoghue had set the world circuit speed record in a Porsche 917-30 at 355 km per hour. This time, Mercedes switched back to petrol power for the C111-4 with a twin turbocharged M117 V8. Bored out to 4.8 litres, producing 500 horsepower. The aerodynamics were again reworked, with large splitters added front and rear and an extra vertical stabiliser. Michelin even developed a set of high-speed tyres especially for the car. In 1979, the car achieved an average speed of 404 km per hour, or 251 miles per hour. The team had achieved everything they set out to do, broken every record, remarkable feats in engineering and aerodynamics. All except, of course, produce a saleable successor to the 300 SL. Naturally, they'll tell you they never set out to replace the SL. But you can't tell me it wasn't a little bit in everyone's minds when all those blank checks were arriving, and the car looked like it did. We know there were board meetings to discuss a version of the C111 for public consumption. Unfortunately, the cars never met the exacting standards of the company that was producing the best engineered and quality controlled passenger cars in the world. And the fuel crisis had been the nail in the coffin. Who knows what might have happened had things been different.